So, a very good morning to everybody who's listening to me. And this FTP session is focusing generally the whole FTP is structured around reading, and this particular session is around inculcating reading habits, which I think is a rather interesting topic and also a little, what shall we say, not that easy to deal with topic, though apparently it looks rather innocuous. Inculcate reading habit is the topic. How to do that? So the when I began working on it, the questions that puzzled me were it was it even possible? Was it a possible task to attempt to inculcate reading habit? Is it easy to do that? Generally, inculcating habits is a difficult thing because habits are something that you have to develop on your own, your volition. The individual's volition and involvement are the prime things. But in our context, certainly, when we teach language, it becomes a big necessity for us to ensure that our students have sufficient practice in English language skills or whatever language they are aiming to acquire. So, certainly, we have to spend some thought on how to do this, how we can get people to read meaningfully. So, in fact, I shouldn't be playing too much with the word inculcate. Still, the word inculcate would mean instill something. We can do a lot of things. We can instill many ideas into our students, into our children's brains through constant, we have our own ways of doing it, cajoling them, threatening them, compelling them. So many ways are there to teach them different habits. The behaviorist school would have recommended many ways of doing it. But a habit like reading, which is something that one has to do on one's own and one has to enjoy doing, the question of whether we can inculcate continues to be a problem. So what I felt was that acquiring reading habit is hard enough. Then inculcating is even harder. But the purpose of FDPs are to spend time on thinking, mulling over how we can solve problems like this, how we can surmount issues which seem to be difficult to surmount. I thought I'll begin with a few thoughts about reading books, reading in general. And I need to emphasize here that when I talk about reading in this session, I mean reading for pleasure. The kind of wide reading which we constantly advocate so that the students have practice in language. When we look at it from the language perspective, reading provides a lot of input. So that is one prime necessity. As teachers of English, we have to ensure that our students read enough, and that reading more largely has to happen outside the classroom. The reading that we give practice in the classroom are, as we know, in intensive reading, where I would say it's a totally different kind of thing. Totally different thing. The reading that happens in the classroom, in the activities we develop for them, when we encourage them to read a bit of from the textbook, a course book, or maybe if they are studying their subject, they spend time reading a lesson on some particular subject in English, in the target language. That is a different kind of reading. The reading I would talk about throughout this session is reading outside the classroom, not maybe with an examination in mind. The kind of general reading which we do, which we always advocate as having many benefits. I'm not going to talk about the benefits of reading because that would take up a whole session on its own virtue. So here I am worried about reading outside the classroom for pleasure, not very conscious about developing language. And going beyond language, reading, as we know, has innumerable benefits which cannot be supplemented or which cannot be provided by anything else. So a couple of thoughts when we talk about reading books. Well, naturally, it's about reading books or stuff that appear in print. Um, One thing is that not everyone becomes good readers. Not even all English teachers are good readers. Not all Malayalam teachers are good readers. I do not think so. We would have to concede that a good number of language teachers are also good readers. Here again, I do not mean that they don't have excellent skills in reading and comprehending. I mean that have the habit of reading widely, reading constantly. So reading to some is is food and drink for some. So they always have a book around. They even furnish their rooms with books, and they read them also. But for many, people keep books near their bed for two purposes. For some people, they would like to read before they sleep, and some people would want to sleep. Use the books as a sleeping aid, so that they read so that quickly they can fall into a slumber. So we are different. Our tastes are different. Not all of us have equal or the same interest. So naturally, everybody do not become good readers. So the personal differences are there. But because we teach language, many of us read for our livelihood, because as it is part of our profession. But natural readers who find a lot of amusement or lot of interest and lot of what are the words, right? Adjectives. Find reading a thing that a part of your life. It doesn't happen to everybody. That is one thought I have. So we generally assume that all English language students or teachers are good readers. That need not happen. Another thing about language is that you cannot actually. This is the point that we began with about reading. Reading widely is as a habit. It cannot be forced. You see, it can never be forced. It's just like leading the horse to water. You can take the horse to the water, but if only if the horse wants to drink will it do that. So the best thing we can do is to lead our students to books, to take if as parents, rather than giving them instructions about reading, the better option would be to lead them to water. So lead them to the books. So this is the second thought I had about reading. That I talk mostly in this session not as a English language teacher or a trainer, but more as a person who developed reading habit over time, and who has a lot of good experiences with books. So I would be sharing rather personal observations, both as a reader who grew up with books, and also as a person who has attempted to get others to read books. So my children, for example, and also the people I have taught over time, even before my children arrived, I have attempted to get other people to read with partial success. That's one interesting example of when I was an undergraduate. I was also teaching a young boy who was then in his 7th or 8th standard. And his father wanted me to help him with his English and get him to read. And I used to take with me simple books for him to read and leave it with him. But I later found that he never actually read those books. But his sister was reading them. She was a few years younger to him, and she was reading all these books. And years later, when these children grew up, and I met them long after those days when I used to visit them to teach was over. The girl was telling me that it was because of you that I developed a reading habit, and also later on I got a job, I became a bank officer, etc., etc. All that I owe to the reading, and you are the reason. So it's a very indirect way of I took one horse to the water and another horse drank. So such things can happen all the time. So reading is not something that we can advise anybody into. So That is one point. And again, from personal experience, this is a book I have shared here. This Northern Lights. This is a book in my bookshelf, a very old book. My father bought this in 1970 or so, and I remember he had kept it. My father was a teacher, and he had a great respect for books. He was not a big reader himself. He never read anything more than the newspaper. Avid newspaper reader he was. But he had, because of his respect for books, he had bought and kept many books, and he also preserved all the books that he studied. He went to did his intermediate, his BA, his B.Ed, etc. in the 1950s, and most of the books that he, particularly the readers, the textbooks which of general interest, English textbooks, plays, Shakespeare's plays included, he had preserved all that. So many of the books that my father learned in the 50s, I also learned in the 80s when I was doing my BA and MA. But the beauty is that he had all these books, but he never really. I'm not sure if he was even aware that books were there. Because of his respect, he had kept them, and I used them. But this book, Northern Light, it is a very beautiful looking book, and my father constantly used to ask me to read this book. He would say, he wouldn't compel me, but he would say, see, look at this is a very nice book. It has very many nice stories. Why don't you read them? And the interesting thing is that remains one book which is still with me. This is an actual photograph I took yesterday. Is one book that I have never read. Somehow, my father never forced me, but somehow, because he asked me to read, I did not read that book. And another book that he asked me to read similarly, I think in my whole life there were only 2 textbooks he asked me to read. Otherwise, he would always ask me to read physics, chemistry, and mathematics, which I did not. It was very wicked of me. I should have. Anyway, another book that my father constantly asked me to read was the book named Kidnapped. Not a very pretty book, but he would ask me to read, saying it is an interesting book. But somehow, when he told me to read, like when he asked me to drink water, the horse refused to drink. But when he just took me to the water, all those other books that he had, I made use of. And a generation from then, this is one book, Life of Pi, which I found very amusing, and which I suggested to my daughter, why don't you read it? And that remains one book that she has not read so far. So even yesterday she was telling me, if you had not told me to read it, if you had just kept it on the shelf, maybe I would have read it. I do not know the psychology behind it, but this seems to be the case. But anyway, believe me, this is not something limited to my family. My story with my father and my children's story, it seems to be a wider one, because this is a sentence, a passage from an essay written by the reputed Malayalam writer, critic, philosopher Sukumar Azhikode. This is my translation of his Malayalam words, and he says, he has written, but he passed away several years back. My father had many books. This is Sukumar Azhikode's father. He was also a professor. My father had many books. He never asked me to read them. Had he done it, I would not have read any of them. This is what Professor Sukumar Azhikode wrote in an essay called Vayanayude Swargam, the heaven of reading. Well, I think there is some point in that. Well, another interesting thing about books is that every generation has its own books that they would prefer to read. I grew up, and many people of my generation certainly grew up in terms of reading. I used to read Malayalam as well, because Malayalam is my mother tongue. A lot of Malayalam works I used to read. But coming to English, the books that my generation of children, maybe who are 9-year-olds, 10, 11, 12, that period, we used to read books like those written by Enid Blyton, for example. I've read over time every single word that this lady wrote, and Hardy Boys were a hot favorite of boys at that time, and Indrajal comics, Phantom, Flash Gordon, etc., and so many other books of that kind. But when it came to my children, and because of my fascination for these, I had When a library in Trivandrum was selling out their old books, I bought a huge collection of Enid Blyton and stuff. Then my children were quite small, and I had kept them all in my shelf, hoping that one day they will discover this treasure. But what happened was they never did. They never bothered to read Enid Blyton. And I was very unhappy, but I did not force them to read or even ask them to read because I knew that that might not work. But then I discovered later that they were also reading. They were reading too. They were reading their own books, which came with which they could vibe more, like Goosebump series or whatever. All kinds of books, which maybe some of these books we may think now this is no good. The books that I used to read when I was young are much better. That every generation has that feeling, which is not to be taken very seriously. But the fact is, every generation has its books. So the idea is that there is no point in my desiring that the next generation should enjoy the books I did. So point number one, I can never kind of force or cajole anybody to read. I can never expect another person to read a book that I liked a lot. That subjectively, my books, and not only every generation, but every individual has his books. So what I like need not be liked by anybody else, and what my generation used to like need not be liked by another generation. Another interesting thing we need to remember is that this is not to be said very generally. There may be, because individuals are very different, there may be many individuals who would do exactly as their parents tell them. That's very possible, but I think the wide majority out there have this tendency not to do what they are told. That is one difficulty with education, basically, I would believe, because children, as they grow up, particularly in the adolescence, they have this tendency to rebel, which is inherent in everybody. Perhaps it's a necessary part of growing up. And at that age, most of our students belong to that age. And it's very unlikely that they would do exactly what they tell them to do. Because they have instinctively, they have this tendency not to do it. That is the one big problem that we have with our adolescent students. I think constantly we have this problem. And when it comes to developing reading habit, it becomes an even bigger problem. Yeah, so as I was saying, when we talk about reading, the textbooks, another matter. Here, I am talking about the voluntary reading that students are to do outside the classroom, over which we don't have a lot of control. So, how do we, inculcate, to use that word again, reading habit, or encourage them to read outside the classroom? One thing is we need to have a clarity about this. We need to remember that when we extensive reading or reading outside the classroom is where actual learning of language happens. This is a known fact, but still I'd like to remind you of that. This fact that learning happens outside the classroom largely. Language learning, any learning for that matter. We can only give them samples in the classroom, and the actual learning certainly happens outside the classroom. And when we talk about reading, it is silent reading. It is, the role of dictionary I will come to. And okay, we have decided to inculcate reading habit among our students. We have decided that so today onwards I'm going to get my students to read books. So how do you do that? First thing is that if you don't have the habit of reading widely, we need to develop that first. So before we think of encouraging our students to be big readers, wide readers, we have to start doing that. So as individuals, the best thing that can happen to you is when you fall in love with books, because nobody in this world is reliable, and only books are. Books can never cheat you. They will always be with you. So the only reliable friend, other than yourself, is the books that you read. So many people say that you are your only reliable friend, and books are also your very reliable friends. They never fail you. So that is, I'm giving you a personal reason to start reading. Many teachers have reading habit, but there are maybe many of us who still haven't, developed the habit of reading widely. This is, please do not misunderstand. We all are scholars. We read a lot of books for our research, for our teaching, but I am talking about reading all kinds of things. So as I referred to Professor Sugumar Ajikot, he once said that I would read anything. I would read even a railway ticket. So that kind of reading. So where you have this passion for reading. So reading replaces all other entertainments that we have. Well, so that is one thing. If we don't have the habit of reading, it might be a good idea to develop that habit ourselves. And then when you have this reading thirst for reading, this habit of reading, then you can share your reading experience with students. And even if you don't wait for the next 30 years to start a reading habit and then do it. But I was saying that it will be a good idea if we haven't the practice of reading. Would be nice to read widely, not only your subject but all kinds of things. One thing, but whether you do that or not, you certainly have this reading in you. We have read many books, so share the reading experience with the student, and this has to be done very subtly. It has to be, you intersperse your reading experience in your teaching, throughout your teaching. So because you don't have to give a lecture on the necessity of reading, which would be a big folly. Because if you give a lecture, then that will be a demotivating thing. Very often, when motivation speakers do it, sometimes you feel students are temporarily motivated. But reading is something that has to happen over time, and so we need to handle it very subtly. So lectures on the importance of reading may not help. So rather than sharing your experience of reading with the students in the classroom, the experience that you had, you can say that you can refer to the source. This is where I picked up that idea. This is where I learned that important life lesson in this particular book. So that kind of thing. And I have here drawn a distinction between parent teachers and teacher parents. Sometimes we talk about, in terms of metaphorically, we talk about our students as our children. But that may not be a very good idea, because parents are parents and teachers are teachers, even though teachers sometimes have this parenting role. Parenting is a big responsibility. It's a subtle term. It's not giving birth to children, it is nurturing them, is parenting. And teachers have a long-term responsibility in that as well. Parenting is a social responsibility too. It's not only the responsibility of the parents, it's a social responsibility. Everyone is accountable. Everyone is accountable for the growing young people around them, because on them depend a lot of things in the future. So in the household, as parents, actually reading habit should start very young, and parents can do a lot of things. But we know our parents have several difficulties. Many of our children are first generation learners. That may not happen. Ideally, I've said what should happen at home and what should happen in the class. It's good if there is a lot of reading at home. If the parents read, then the children take them as examples. We all know that children do not do what their parents tell them. They do what the parents do. So if you as parents read a lot, your children no doubt will pick that habit. And then another thing is, the thing ideally to be done at home is to read loudly to your children. It's a good idea to do that. Not a good idea, it's a compulsory thing. If you read to your children, they would grow up developing a kind of fascination not only for books but for the world of knowledge, which is what we try to do all the time. And no lecturing on reading. At home, you don't make speeches on reading. If you do, probably your children will stop reading. And being together with books is another very important thing. That is, you spend quality time. This is at home. Quality time with your children, with books. So children. Well, there is not much point talking about that in this platform, because we are here in the capacity of teachers. But it will be good to do that. When parents spend time reading to the children or reading together, it's wonderful. But in the classes, what we can do as teachers, so we cannot read books in the class and show them, hoping the children will emulate us. We can't do that. But we can share our experience reading. So that's what I was saying. Throughout our teaching, we can bring in points where we tell them about your encounters with books. So how you hunted for a particular book, or how you came up with a nice idea in a book, or all those things, how you related something in your life with that, etc. So share your reading experience with your students. You can also read bits to your students. You can take books to the class. That's the last point of being together with books. Take books to your class and don't give it to the children, because they will not give it back. Don't give your books to anybody. Keep your books to yourself. They tell them to borrow books from the library. Don't be too liberal and start giving books to your students, because they'll never give it back to you. That is a proverbial thing about people don't give books back. So to whomever you give, it's very likely you will lose it. But if you don't have a good library, then maybe you should take initiatives to do that. And LTI has been doing a lot of work in this direction, about setting up reading clubs and things. So, but it's good to take books to the classroom, maybe a book from the library, maybe your own copy, and briefly talk about it, refer to it, just keep it on the table, so that students have this exposure to books. They need to look at that. They should feel slightly tempted. So my teacher is doing it. Whatever whatever kind of a teacher, a personality you are, remember, you leave some lasting impression on your students. So if you are a person who is always seen with books, students are a small minority at least, are likely to start reading simply because of that. And no big lectures on reading, the benefits of reading, maybe subtle, limited lectures. By lecture, I do not mean a long harangue, but I just meant, the kind of thing we do. Children, it's very necessary for you to read. You look at that, look at Ambedkar, he has read, that kind of thing we always do a lot, I think. And maybe a little bit will be good in that direction. But more than that, the students would benefit more if you share your reading experience with them and see you around with books. And yeah, those are ideas about. And for the rest of the session, I'm going to look at a few points about developing reading habit. None of these are new. But what I have tried to do here is, over my several years of experience as a teacher, and on different capacities, encounters in outside the classroom, people have come with the interest to learn language, and from all those things, from experience, what some points I have put together here, so which I am rather confident will work if we try. So even though I began saying inculcating reading habit is not a very possible thing, it is not impossible too. If we do it very carefully, and I'm using the word subtly, we may be able to do quite a lot in this direction. So, and the points that we are going to discuss are not to be told to the students. This is one thing we constantly need to remember. Is there are many things that we are supposed to keep in mind as teachers. For example, the grammatical rules, grammatical terminology, etc. And we always say that. And also many theoretical ideas are to be kept with the teacher, and these things are to be given to the students in a different fashion. We do not, give them a big description of a sentence structure. That description is meant for us, the teacher's kind of part of the teacher's knowledge. So here, the things we are going to discuss here are to become part of teacher's knowledge, which already are there, which I'm just reminding, which we subtly incorporate in our discussions with the students. So these points, if we can remember, well, these are rather subjective. I might have left out many other important things, because individuals are different. So there is no finally making a statement about this is the way things can be done. There are so many ways in which things can be done, but I am looking at a few based on my personal experience. One thing is, if for those wanting to start reading, so those young people in our class, they can be in a school level class, they can be in even an MA student, even a PhD student might be there who still has not developed a reading habit in whichever language it may be. But I'm particularly, though we are talking about English, reading habit is a general thing. So it's very necessary that you should read in your mother tongue as well. The books, in the best books or whatever, written in your or the books you like written in your mother tongue is a very good idea. You have to do that. Our students have to do, I would expect a Malayali student doing an MA to read quite a lot in Malayalam as well, because literature is no longer limited to any language. It's a wide ocean, and you are the best person to be an authority of those works written in your own mother tongue. That is very essential. But for so many of the things I mentioned here might work with your mother tongue reading also, but particularly I have English in mind. So very often, when students come and ask us, what shall I begin to read with? Suggest a book for me. And very often I have felt that in school, my experience as a student in school and college, teachers constantly would say that, see, you should read Mahatma Gandhi's My Experiments with Truth, read Nehru's Discovery of India, etc. Certainly I feel that my teachers probably never read those books. I even doubt if they even saw those books when they recommended them, because a 8 standard student wouldn't want to read Discovery of India. Though it's a good idea to have the knowledge that there is such a book, which I might look at sometime later in my life. But though Glimpses of World History is an even more fascinating book, which if you'd like to read in school, even in the school level. Which is a book to start reading with. It's not a very good idea to suggest a bestseller, a classic, simply because Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Why don't you go and read it? Well, not always a brilliant idea with the book you are going to begin reading with. What is the book best for that? That's the idea. And you do not start reading a book simply because your brother liked it, or not because a teacher said it. It's all good. It's good to read a bestseller. It's good to read a classic. It's good to read a book that your brother liked. It's good to read a book that your teacher recommended. But more than that, I would say the choice should come from the person. So whenever, often students ask me which is a book I shall read, I find it very difficult to make a suggestion. I would rather say you go to a bookstall or go to a library or wherever you have access to books, pick up a book that you think you're going to like, because our tastes are different. It need not, very often I would say begin the stories. The best thing to read is stories, to begin with, novel stories, etc. But if you have a fascination for some other thing, some craft, or some maybe something related to your subject, start with that. There are no rules about what books should be read. The only thing is that you should read as much as possible. And often ideally it's a book with many pictures, maybe, to begin with. So that is first one was start reading books you like. Another thing is that particularly in the beginning level, it's better to start. This looks very silly, but it's a very, very important thing. Start with thinner books. See, so very often I've seen it happening. People take a book. I remember when I was in my pre-degree, one of my friends took a membership in the Trivandrum Public Library, and he came back with some very strange books. What was that? I remember they were very classic Malayalam works written in when Malayalam and Tamil, etc., had not quite become distinguished. Some very ancient text he took, because the reference to that book was there in the textbook that we studied, Indian history, in fact. But it's okay. It's okay. He might have taken it and he might have found it difficult and given back. But there's one danger as well. Sometimes you take a book, a voluminous book, and like War and Peace, for example. You feel very happy. It's a very lovely looking book. You take it home and start reading. You read a few pages and you get tired. And then probably that will be the last book you read, because you never quite finish it. So, but if you go for a very thin volume, maybe an abridged, retold version of War and Peace, you as a beginner might finish that in a day or 2 days or 3 days. And it's simpler, particularly books meant for children. It doesn't imply that the readers are children. Maybe at 25, at 30, at 40, at 50 you can start reading, but you can start with books meant for children, because only the language level is meant. It's not your intellectual or level that is intended, because your comfort that language is not that good. Maybe you can write scholarly articles, but still, in terms of reading, many of us are beginners. So read books that are, easily you can easily finish. So suppose a book takes you 5 months to finish, and probably that you may not read a lot after that. You would have slowly, painstakingly done that, and that also happens only to a few. Most likely you will abandon that book with a slight feeling of guilt whenever you see it on the table. But if you go for this is meant for students. Remember, I'm not preaching to teachers who are listening to me. So when I say you, I mean the beginner learner. So if you go for a thin book, the thing is you finish it rather quickly, and you have the sense of having achieved something. Even though it's a small book with just 35 pages, it is a book. So you can say that I have read a book, and then you can go for another book. So this is also psychologically important. The feeling that I have read many books. So, and we don't have to worry about the level, because the children who read comics a lot will gradually graduate to higher things. So there is no need to worry about the size of the book, what kind of book the students are reading. If only the most important thing is they should be uninhibitedly, in an uninterrupted manner, they should be able to choose their books, pick their books, and read it for long. When we study, we always say that you should take notes. We do that. When you have Matthew Arnold doing, certainly it's a good idea to keep notes. But when you read for pleasure, extensive reading, don't tell your students to take notes. If they want, it's a fine thing. But I've written, do not take notes. Don't take me negatively. This is about extensive reading. You're reading a book, a novel, and if you have the feeling that I should take notes, that will slow down the process considerably. Again, it's very likely that the continuity of the reading habit would be impeded at the very beginning. So when you when you suggest learners, when you recommend reading to learners, do not tell them to take notes. We do that very often. That's why I'm saying. Very often we say, okay, you read that book and write a summary of it. So when the reading is a pleasurable thing, it is followed by a task, that pleasure is largely limited. It will work well with a few learners. See, as I was telling you, who are very logically ordered in their character, might enjoy that and do it, and that may not hamper further reading. But the better thing for when it comes to extensive reading is to go from one book to the other rather than having a task. Task certainly should be there. Note taking certainly should be there. But that happens when we give them practice in intensive reading in the classroom. When they are preparing, they are doing an activity based on a reading text, certainly they will take note and they will have a post-reading activity, all that. But the books that they read at home, you need to be a bit careful about asking them to keep notes about that, about the books. If a student has that habit, it's fine. But I've put it here because teachers need to remember that could be a hindering fact if you insist on that. Because reading, extensive reading is a continuous kind of thing. You don't stop every other word and ponder about what does this word mean. If you ponder on that and you plan to take note, this is something I liked, I write down. That process of the flow of reading will be largely impeded. So extensive reading is a very continuous reading, rather natural, relaxed kind of thing, without much thought about the keeping notes, etc. Another thing is, again, you might think that I am being slightly or illogical here. Do not keep a dictionary near. This again, when you are studying, certainly keep a dictionary on your table. But when you are reading a book for pleasure, extensive reading, a dictionary can be your biggest enemy. Because if you, the point is that if students have this constant instruction of the teacher that whenever you come across a difficult word, run to the dictionary. If that is the message that the student has, when he tries to read a novel too, whenever he comes across a new word, he would have the compulsion to look up in the dictionary. So while in extensive reading, you can give the students the idea notion that you don't really worry about every new word that you come across, and learning the meaning of a word need not always be done with the help of a dictionary. And in extensive reading, when you come across a word repeatedly, you will gradually get to know the meaning of it. And if there is a word that is particularly troublesome, perhaps you do check in a dictionary, but never tell them to run to a dictionary for every new word they come across. They have to learn. They have the practice of picking the meaning from the context is very important. Another thing is that dictionary. Very often, students feel that dictionaries have the meaning. Dictionaries do not actually have all the meaning. The meaning is different in context, and the meaning you construct may be different. So, dictionaries can sometimes limit that kind of a wide enjoyment. And another thing is that thing I about reading is that this is applicable to teachers, so that students become a model. Carry your books around, and well, this is many of us do that. Have a book in your bag, and we often say that we don't have time. We actually have a lot of time. We don't have time. There's a lot of time we spend waiting outside a doctor's room, waiting when somebody is unwell. Maybe you sit with him in the hospital for hours. Maybe you wait at the railway station or the bus stand. Here, there, many hours of waiting we have, and those are times which we can make use for reading. So if you keep your book in your bag with you all the time, you can read it anywhere. So carry. So I used to have a friend who sometimes asks, "What is a book you are reading these days, Lal?" That's an inspiring kind of thing. The subtle idea that you are supposed to be reading something all the time is for enjoyment. So carrying your book around is a very good idea, and that again, you cannot tell your students to do that, because telling doesn't help. You can show them by when they come to the staff room. If you see you reading a book, that might be a good inspiration for them. So carry books around. That will help reading habit more. Well, I used to do that. I used to in the 70s, late 70s and 80s. I even used to walk through Trivandrum, Palayam, Statue region, etc., reading books. I was very young at that time, naturally, and and cities where the vehicles weren't half this much, and so I used to read that. I wouldn't recommend that today, unless you want to have a premature bye-bye to the world in the streets these days. But I used to do that. Well, not a very normal thing to do, I would say. But still, carrying books around is indeed a good idea. Another thing is, many people have this people, particularly people who are very logically inclined, would set goals. So I am going to read 25 books this month, and you work for that. And finally, you see that month you don't read anything at all, and then you feel disappointed, and the whole project fails. You don't derive happiness from that. That's the thing about thin book is again one thing. I'm going to read 5 books, and you read 5 thin books, you have attained your goal. But primarily, I would say don't set too many goals, because that's a slightly artificial thing. That's a limiting thing. But many people like that, and it is okay if you do that. But it is not a must. That's why I'm saying, because I know by my nature, I do not like setting goals in terms of leisure time reading. Certainly in my work, in my research, I would set goals. But in terms of leisure time reading, any leisure time activity for that, I wouldn't want to set goals. But if you think you should you do that, but don't set unattainable goals. That's one thing we teachers always need to keep in mind. The goals we set should be attainable for the students, and students should be encouraged to set attainable goals. So if you have the capacity only to read 4 books, set a goal for 4 books, because the reason is, if you attain that goal, you feel heavily motivated to go on. And if you set an unattainable goal and you fail, then maybe that impedes the process. Frequent visits to bookstores, exhibitions, book exhibitions, libraries. Well, maybe COVID prevents that from doing it right now, but things will be different soon. And very important, part of reading is you need to be with books. being with books, taking the book, enjoying the smell of the book perhaps, and reading the blurb. That is very important. Even if you do not read the book whole, you take the book and be familiar with it. Encourage the learners, give them opportunities to do that. Maybe trick them into going to the library and searching for books and bringing a volume for you, for example. But then they also have this experience with books, and maybe they will be tempted to read books on their own. So this is very important. Awareness of different kind of reading. This is again an important thing. This again is something that impedes spontaneous and extensive reading, because if you read a novel as if you are reading a textbook, then you have this problem. Then you would want to take notes, as we mentioned already. You would want to understand everything that is written there. You would want to look up in the dictionary every often. So reading a novel like a textbook is not a good idea. The students need to have that in their mind. So all those skimming, scanning things we learn in our teacher training things, this is where we need to apply that. Students need to know that some books are to be read quickly. You need not stop and ponder unless there's something, you're fascinated by something. You may not understand everything you read, but you go on reading, still go on reading. So that is one important lesson that students should remember. Very many students, they have a feeling that my friend reads many books and I'm not able to read. The friend probably reads without understanding, which is an okay thing again. It's important you read. The understanding will come eventually. The more you read, I think that I remember two of the books that I read, in the very first two books. One, the title I've forgotten. It's about some children living in Africa. I virtually read the whole book without understanding anything, except the general feel of some children living in the African wilderness. And the second was a book written by Enid Blyton named Hurrah for the Circus. Again, I only understood the general flow, but not the details. But gradually, over time, it happens. So a textbook is different. You have to read it, you have to understand it, you have to consult somebody, you go for an extra class if necessary and understand it. But novel is not to be read like that. And again, reading a newspaper is again a different thing. You don't actually read a newspaper, you just go through the newspaper, that kind of thing. Different kinds of reading. And again, this is another important thing that we need to remember. You are not committed to a book. A textbook, yes, but a book for leisure, you are not committed to it. You take a book, you read a few pages, you do not like it, try 2 more pages, still you do not like it. You have the freedom to abandon that book. You don't have to forcefully try to finish that book. If you read, very often the first page you will not like, second page you wouldn't like, third, fourth, fifth, you will start loving the book. But if that love doesn't come in 10 pages, 15 pages, still you find it a task. You have the freedom to set that book aside and go for another book. But I'm sure you might come back to that book again at some later stage and finish it. I did that with God of Small Things, remember. Okay, finding time with books. As already I mentioned, constantly we have this excuse that I don't have time. We do have time. Just keep the book in your bag, make it available. You will find that you will have time for that. And coming to the very modern situation where we're living, we have this option now to read ebooks. Certainly reading ebooks is equal to reading paper books. Internationally, there are people who do not read books at all. They only read paper books at all. They read only ebooks. Perfectly fine. That is your choice. Personal likes are important there. Ebooks, I am not talking about ebooks because there are sessions on ebooks later, but I would say reading ebooks, okay, perfectly as good as reading paper books. It's your choice. And again, as I told you, waiting at the hospital, waiting in the railway station, being in the bus, etc., you have even inside a vehicle where reading is difficult, when the vehicle is shaking, you can listen to books. So ebooks, coming from ebooks to audiobooks is a big blessing, I would say, particularly people who have difficulty reading a lot, vision problem or issues like that, and also people who who do not want to disturb others, or who do not want to uh, want others to know that you're reading, audiobooks are excellent. You can listen to them wherever you are. Just a small device will be there in your ear, and you'll be listening to audiobooks. Listening to audiobooks, I wouldn't say it's equal to reading, because reading is another skill. For that, physical reading is essential. But particularly to teachers who are with me, and carrying down to the students, listening to audiobooks is another excellent option. And you have many audiobooks are, YouTube is an immense, so you need to look for it, search for, there are books with subtitles. It's called subtitles because the text will be displayed and you hear the audio. There are simply thousands of books are out there in YouTube. Search audiobooks with subtitles, they'll come. Even yesterday I was listening to Model Millionaire again. Very well narrated. Immense lot of audiobooks are there in YouTube. And if you want to listen to more recent works in the audio form, Audible is a good option. Amazon, it's a paid thing, but you will get to read listen to more recent books. LibriVox is there. All these have apps which you can install in your phone and read. LibriVox is again not read, listen to. LibriVox is another option, but all those books which have beyond the copyright rules, or written before that, 50 years before, or who are not bound by copyright, are there in LibriVox. Only thing about LibriVox is that not all are very professionally read, so you may have a slight problem with that, but still it is good. And all the other things apply here also. Read to small, maybe you wouldn't want to listen a 24-hour long audiobook initially, but that can happen later on when you have more practice. But for beginners, maybe you'll go for smaller, more manageable stories of about under an hour each. So that is another option. I wouldn't say equal to, but equally important. Another thing is, we need to develop this habit of buying books. Books are now more manageable than they used to be. Books used to be very expensive. There are expensive books even now, but books are, many people would say that they don't have money for buying, students. But I think if you really want, you can
Excuse
save
me,
up and
sir.
buy a book. Yes, time?
Sir, sorry to interrupt. It's time, sir. Shall we move on to the Q&A session?
I'll conclude. Give me 2 minutes. Okay, so
Sorry, sir.
I'll conclude now. Give me 2 minutes. Okay?
Okay, sir.
Yeah, yeah. So buying books, I'm just finishing. Buying books. And another thing, in fact, the one I would conclude with is that don't recommend a book to your student that you yourself haven't read. So this takes us back to the first thing that I said about starting to teach reading. Start reading yourself. So when you become a rich, wide reader, then you'll have the moral command to advise your students to start reading as well. So I'll conclude there. Thank you. Now we'll go for questions if there are.